Chapter 47. The following day, before they broke camp and set out, Malcolm insisted on giving Halt a complete physical examination. "Let's make sure you're up to all this exertion," he said. "Take off your shirt and sit down here." He indicated a fallen log that was close to the fireplace. "Of course I'm up to it," Halt told him briskly. But then he realized he'd met his match when it came to stubbornness. The healer stepped back and drew himself to his full height. Since he was a little shorter than Halt, who wasn't the tallest person in the kingdom, this of itself didn't amount to a great deal. But his air of authority added immensely to his stature. "Look here," he said severely. "Your former apprentice dragged me across league after league of wild country on a half-mad horse in the middle of the night to come here and save your miserable, ungrateful hide, which I did without complaint or hesitation. Now I intend to finish the job I started, and not let you finish the job the Genovesan started. So I intend to give you a complete check-over now to make sure you're fit again, and up to the relatively minor task of confronting 100-odd enemies with just 2 people to back you up. Is that perfectly all right with you?" When he put it that way, Holt had to admit that he had a point, and he knew he owed the bird-like man his life. But still, it went against the grain for Holt to submit meekly to anyone's orders, as King Duncan had discovered on several occasions. He threw out one last challenge. "And if it's not all right with me?" he said belligerently. But Malcolm matched his attitude, stepping forward so that his face was only a few centimeters from the rangers. "Then I'll ask Will to report the fact to this Lady Pauline I've heard so much about," he said. He was rewarded by a quick flicker of doubt in Holt's eyes. "And I'll do it," Will called from the other side of the campsite, where he had been sitting quietly for several minutes, enjoying the clash of wills between these 2 stubborn men. "Well, I suppose you might as well," Holt said, and, stripping off his shirt, he straddled the log. Malcolm began his examination, peering into his throat and eyes and ears, tapping him on the inside of the elbows with a soft wood mallet, placing a hollow tube with a bell-shaped end against his back and chest, and putting his ear to the other end. "What's that for?" Horace asked. He had moved closer as Malcolm went to work, and now he stood a few paces away, watching with interest, in spite of Holt's growing irritation. "It's none of your business," the ranger growled warningly. But Horace was not to be deterred. "What can you hear?" he asked Malcolm. The healer hid a smile as he answered, "His heart and lungs." Horace made a small mew of interest. "Really? What do they sound like?" "It's none of his business what my heart and lungs sound like," Halt began. But Malcolm was already beckoning Horace forward. "Have a listen for yourself." Halt reflected how difficult it was to retain dignity and authority when someone else was poking and probing and tapping, and you were sitting, half-dressed, on a log. He glared at Horace, but the young warrior ignored him. Stepping forward eagerly, Horace held the end of the tube in his ear, bending to put the large end against Halt's back. His eyes widened as he listened. "That's amazing," he said. "Is that boompa 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 sound his heartbeat?" "Yes," Malcolm said, smiling. Like most people, he enjoyed showing off his expertise in his chosen field. "It's very strong and regular." "I'll say it is." Horace was impressed both by Malcolm's medical knowledge and by the sheer volume of Holt's heartbeat when it was amplified by the tube. "You're like a regular bass drum in there, Halt." How kind of you to say so, Halt said, a sour expression on his face. But Horace was still eager to quiz Malcolm further. And what about that great rushing whoosh, whoosh sound? It's vaguely like a draft horse breaking wind. That's his lungs, his breathing, Malcolm replied. Again, quite healthy, although that's an original description of the sound, I must say. Haven't seen that in any of my medical texts. Let me have another listen, Horace said, and he bent once more towards Halt's back. But the angry ranger twisted round on the log to confront him. Get away from me! Listen to your own heart and lungs if you must. Horace shrugged apologetically, showing him the straight listening tube. That's a little difficult, Halt. I'd have to twist my head right round behind my back to do that. Halt smiled evilly at him. I'm sure I could manage that for you, he said. Horace regarded him for a moment, trying to ascertain if he were joking. He decided that he wasn't totally sure, so he stepped away, handing the tube to Malcolm. Might be best if you continue, he said. Malcolm took the tube back and continued with his examination. 15 minutes later, he announced that he was satisfied. You're strong as a horse, he told Halt. The ranger glared back at him. And you're stubborn as a mule. Malcolm shrugged. People do say that, he replied, without taking offence. Horace, who had withdrawn to watch the rest of the examination, now stood and moved forward as Halt pulled his shirt over his head again. The ranger looked up at him, still less than pleased with him. What do you want? He asked belligerently. My heart and lungs have been put away for the day, I'm afraid. But Horace pointed to Halt's face. The beard, he said. If you decide to impersonate Ferris again, you'll need a shave. Which I can attend to myself, Halt told him. But if you want to make yourself useful while I'm doing so, get a few strips of leather and plait a headband like the one Ferris wore. Horace nodded, and while Halt fetched hot water and trimmed his regrowing beard back to a semblance of Ferris's more subdued version, Horace found some leather thongs in his pack and plaited them together, creating a reasonable facsimile of the simple royal crown of Clonmel. Halt was rinsing the lather from his face when he noticed Malcolm carefully packing a small box with a dozen irregular-shaped balls of what appeared to be dried brown mud. Are they more of those whiz-bangs you were playing with? He asked. The healer nodded. He didn't look up from his task, and Halt, stepping closer, could see that he had the box packed with bundles of cut grass, which he used to keep the mud balls separated. The tip of Malcolm's tongue protruded through his teeth as he concentrated on his work. What do they do exactly? Halt asked. The final ball packed carefully in the grass, Malcolm looked up. If I throw one on the ground, he explained, it will create a loud bang and a thick cloud of yellow-brown smoke. They're very volatile. That's why I need to pack them so carefully. And what did you plan on doing with them? Halt asked. I thought they might come in handy if you needed a diversion. They won't actually injure anyone. He hesitated, then amended that thought. Well, aside from setting their ears ringing, they're just noise and smoke makers. Halt grunted thoughtfully, but said nothing more. He was beginning to see a possible use for the noisemakers. Finally, with their preparations complete, they struck camp and moved forward, closer to the range of cliffs where Tennyson had gone to ground, literally. They left the horses well back in the grove of trees that Horace and Will had discovered the previous day, then crept forward to observe the caves. Now what? Malcolm asked. We wait and watch, Halt told him. Malcolm took the hint and settled down, finding himself a comfortable vantage point from which to watch the comings and goings at the cliffs. Not that there was much to see. A group of 4 men left the cave in the late morning, returning several hours later, burdened down by the carcass of a deer. "Hunting party," Horace said. Both Halt and Will looked at him sarcastically. "You think?" Will asked. "Maybe they found the deer and brought him back to repair him." "I was only saying," Horace began, but Halt silenced him. "Then don't," he said briefly. Horace muttered briefly to himself. One of the trials involved in travelling with rangers was times like these. Halt and Will seemed to have boundless reserves of patience, never finding it necessary to lighten the passing hours with idle chatter. Horace didn't think there was any harm in making the occasional remark, even if it weren't absolutely necessary, or enlightening. It was just making conversation, that was all. "And stop muttering," Halt said. Scowling, Horace obeyed. In the early afternoon, 6 people, 4 men and 2 women, emerged from the caves, blinking in the sunlight and shading their eyes with their hands. They didn't seem to have any real purpose in emerging. "What are they up to?" Will asked softly. Horace was about to reply, "Probably getting fresh air," when he remembered Halt's curt orders from several hours back. He clamped his jaw shut and said nothing. "Probably just getting a breath of fresh air," Halt said. Horace glared at him. It wasn't fair, he thought. The small group stayed outside in the sunshine for half an hour, then retreated once more inside the cave. Horace, who had been watching the upper reaches of the cliff, noticed a small ribbon of smoke trickling out of the cleft in the rock once more. He mentioned it to Halt. Well spotted. Could be starting to get the evening meal together." He turned to Will. "When you were in Tennyson's camp, what was his schedule for prayer meetings?" "Morning and late afternoon," Will replied promptly. "After the second one, they'd usually have dinner." So, assuming he hasn't changed his schedule, they might be getting ready for a little bit of hymn singing and hand over your money any time now. Will nodded. "That'd be my guess." Halt looked at his 3 companions. "Let's get ready to join them, shall we? I'd hate to miss the sermon."